Hey everybody, Gage here from Sharp. Thank you so much for tuning in. It's a pleasure to have you with me as always. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about what the difference between a workhorse knife and a laser knife is. But before we jump into the video, I'd just like to kindly ask you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really helps our channel out, gets the word out there, gets more people seeing our videos, and it also gets you notified about whenever we're doing cool giveaways, so make sure you don't miss out on that. Cool, so we are going to start by talking about what would classify a knife as a workhorse and what would classify a knife as a laser.
You know, I have one simple request, and that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
So we'll start by talking about lasers. Lasers are knives that are very thin at the spine and are ground very, very thin behind the edge. They also typically feature what is called a hollow grind, or you could think about the bevels of the knives as being concave. Workhorse knives are knives that are typically quite thick at the spine and are thicker than their laser counterparts behind the edge. They also typically feature what is called a flat grind, so rather than the bevel being like concave on a hollow ground knife, they are, as the name implies, just totally flat as they angle into the edge of the knife. These knives are typically quite robust. You can beat them up a little bit, not worry about them as much, but because they're a little bit thicker, they typically don't have quite the same cutting feel as a laser. So as you might have already guessed through my brief descriptions there are definite advantages and disadvantages to each of these two styles of knives. And depending on your cutting style or the task at hand, one may be more appropriate than the other. So we are going to briefly break down the advantages and disadvantages of each of these knives using three categories to do so. Those three categories are the sharpenability of the knife, the longevity or delicacy of the blade, and the overall cutting feel of the blade. So the first category we're going to talk about is sharpenability. And what we are talking about here is how easy the knife is to sharpen when it's brand new, but also as the knife ages and we continue sharpening it. A laser, because of how thin it is behind the edge and because of the grind that's put on it, that hollow ground bevel, is going to remain thinner as we continue sharpening the knife over time. This means that it's going to be easier to sharpen because there's less material behind the edge to remove to get a new edge created. And it's also going to mean that we retain more of that really amazing cutting feel that we had when the knife was brand new. Again, because the knife is remaining thinner behind the edge even as we sharpen the knife. A workhorse knife, though, is going to have a more resilient edge. It's going to be tougher and less prone to chipping, and we'll talk more about that in the next category. But this is going to make the knife more difficult to sharpen. Maybe not so much when the knife is brand new, but as we sharpen the knife and remove material and it starts to get thicker and thicker behind the edge, it's going to mean that we have to remove more material from our knife to get it sharp again. We're also going to have to think about thinning the knife over time, as because the knife is getting so thick, you are either going to have to suffer from a really terrible cutting feel, or you're going to have to remove material behind the edge to get some of that nice cutting feel back. Thinning the edges of your knife or thinning the bevels of your knife is totally possible. Anyone can do it, but it is a very time-consuming process, and it can require a level of proficiency with your sharpening technique that not all of us have. So it may require you to practice a little bit before you get results that you're really happy with. The next category we're going to talk about is the longevity of the knife, or how delicate it is, or how long it will last. These kind of all fit into one category in our mind because it largely has to do with how well you're maintaining the knife, but also some of the characteristics of the knife, both on either side, are going to either make this easier or harder to do. So what we're kind of talking about here is like chipping or bending or other sort of like weird things that may happen to your knife that will make it less than desirable to use or impossible to use. A laser, we'll start here again. Of course, we've said this many times, is very, very thin spine and behind the edge. This means that the knife is overall going to be a little bit more delicate. Because there's less material, it makes it less strong, and that means that it's going to be easier to chip, easier to bend, easier to warp, and may not stand up to a beating quite as well as a workhorse knife would. Again, workhorses, being a little bit thicker, are going to withstand a little bit rougher treatment. You can dig them into things. They can withstand more sort of torquing and stuff like that, so they won't bend as much. So we would say that in that regard, in terms of like chipping and stuff like that, setting aside like rust and stuff like that on stainless steels, a workhorse knife is typically going to be easier to maintain and will therefore last a little bit longer. Finally, we're going to talk about what is arguably the most important category, which is the cutting feel, or how well these knives perform. And while they both have advantages and disadvantages in this category, I personally gravitate more towards the laser, mostly because of this single factor, and that is the cutting feel of the knife. So what we mean here is how sharp does the knife feel, how easily does it move through your ingredients, and I think it would be hard to say that the laser is not got the advantage in this category. Again, because of how thin the knife is, it's got very little friction along the blade as you're cutting through things. The cutting feel is absolutely effortless with a properly sharpened and maintained laser knife, and they perform at the highest level possible. Workhorse knives, you can get very, very sharp. You can get workhorse knives with amazing cutting feels as well. And they, again, are typically a little bit more resilient and more robust. But because they're typically thicker behind the edge, they're going to cause what's called wedging as we move through an ingredient. It's going to place friction on the sides of the blades, which is going to mean that it doesn't feel as effortless cutting through things. Again, you can still get workhorse feeling very sharp and really great cutting feel, and they are really good for certain tasks, like more robust tasks like squash and stuff like that. But you'll find you'll have to, again, thin them out more as they get older to maintain a like reasonable cutting feel. And I would argue that they're never going to feel as good as a laser. All right, well, there you have it, guys. Leave a comment down below letting us know what you think, which type of knife you would choose, maybe which task you feel one knife is better for than the other. We really want to help everyone out that's watching these videos. So if you have any insight to provide, we're always happy to hear it down below. Once again, make sure to like and subscribe. We really appreciate it, and it helps you learn about giveaways before anyone else. Thanks so much for watching. Stay sharp.